And for our next question, we go to John O'Brien, who asks, what battle took place by accident with no real enemy present? Ah, I know this one. I actually covered it in an older video about typhus, but it deserves its own spotlight. So here you go. The year is 1788, and the place is Karansebes, a small town in the Kingdom of Hungary, which at the time was ruled over by the Habsburg Austrian Empire. In fact, this little town was so small that it wasn't even really a town at all. It was more like a village, one of many that dotted the plains of the Hungarian-Serbian border. These villages were mostly just farms and homesteads separated by wheat fields and vineyards. But they did have one thing in common. They all had a garrison, because this was an area where the Turks were known to make incursions. The Austrians held the fort here in Karansebes, or rather the garrison commander, Captain Ludwig von der Rahn, held the fort, and he did so very well. The fort consisted of a single building, an inn, along with a few other houses that could be used for storage. Inside of that inn was a large hall with a heavy wooden door set into it, and on the night of October, that door was going to become the scene of one of history's greatest own goals. Now, a bit of backstory is in order here. As I mentioned earlier, these villages were built up to defend against Turkish incursions. The Turks, however, hadn't really been active in the region for some time now, thanks in part to the efforts of one man, Field Marshal Prince Paul Don von Littenberg, whose efforts I discussed in my last video. In fact, his most recent success was a battle near Karansebes itself 3 years prior. So why then was he stationed there? Well, if you hold a high enough rank in the military, you get to choose your postings. And Don chose Karansebes because it was where he owned land. He had bought a noble title that granted him a minor nobility in the region, and he spent his free time running his estates. However, while the peace had lasted for 3 years, it was looking as if the Turks might be getting ready to attack again. And Don was not a young man. He was 62 years old and approaching the end of his career. So he wanted to make one last stand. But first, he was going to need some troops. He wrote to his friend Joseph, Baron Van, who was in charge of raising new recruits for the army, and asked for a battalion of infantry to help defend the village. Sonnenfels obliged, sending in a single company of the 4th Battalion under the command of the aforementioned Captain Ludwig von der Rahn. After delivering the men to Karansebes, Sonnenfeld continued on to Vienna, leaving Daron in temporary command of the entire fort. And what does our dear captain do with his brand new soldiers? Goes out drinking. Of course, according to the official report of what happened that night, written by the Baron Sonnenfels himself, Captain Daron went out into the village to recruit some civilians to help build fortifications. While he was gone, the rest of the officers got together to discuss how they would defend the village. Specifically, they drew up a plan to set up 2 barricades in front of the main gate, each guarded by 50 men, with the rest of the soldiers providing support from within the buildings. When Daron returned, he heard the plan and made one change. All 100 men guarding the barricades were to be Hungarians, specifically ethnic Hungarians. Why? Because most of the men in the fort were Germans, and Daron was worried that with all the talk of defending Hungarian soil, the Germans would see this as a pointless mission and refuse to fight. But the Hungarians, well, they were fiercely loyal, so he put them in charge. However, Daron had another problem. See, when he left the fort to go recruiting, he brought all of the weapons with him to hand out. This meant that when he returned, there were no weapons left inside the fort. So naturally, he sent some of the officers back to retrieve them. But when they opened the doors, they saw that the rest of the officers had already gone out into the village to find entertainment. You know, as one does after a hard day of drawing up defensive plans. This meant that the only people left in the fort were those Hungarian soldiers and the civilians that they had recruited, plus a handful of German officers who were too drunk to notice what was about to happen. At around 10 p.m., someone in the village raised an alarm, yelling, "Turks! Turks! The Turks are coming!" Naturally, the guards at the barricades were confused. There were no Turks anywhere, and as far as they knew, there hadn't been any Turks for years. Nevertheless, someone was yelling Turk at the top of their lungs, and the guards didn't want to take any chances. So they did what any good soldiers would do and opened fire on the village. Their muskets roared through the night, shattering windows and ripping holes in the walls of nearby homes. People screamed and ran for cover as bullet after bullet ripped into the night. By now, the officers had returned from their evening out and were getting ready for bed. Most of them had also had a little too much to drink and were completely unaware of what was happening outside. One of them, though an officer named Salvatore Fessler heard the commotion and went out to investigate. He stood in the doorway and watched as one of the Hungarian guards raced past him, firing his musket into the darkness. Fessler stopped him and demanded to know what in the world he was doing. The guard yelled something about the Turks, but Fessler still wasn't convinced. He knew that the Turks weren't attacking. Instead, he was pretty sure that his fellow officers had gotten drunk and were just letting off some fireworks. Still, he knew better than to join them in their revelry, so he went back inside. Meanwhile, the shooting continued for several minutes before the guards finally stopped to reload. During that time, 6 villagers had been killed and 14 wounded. Now, when the firing stopped, people began to emerge from their homes to see what was going on. They had barely made it to the door when more shots rang out and more villagers fell victim to the mysterious attackers. This time, though, the villagers fought back. They grabbed whatever weapons they could and charged towards the fort. Some of the Hungarians saw this and fired at the villagers, but their muskets were almost out of ammo. Soon, the villagers had overwhelmed the first barricade and were tearing down the second. Hearing the commotion, Fessler grabbed his sword and ran to the main gate. He was in time to see a mob of angry villagers tear it down and charge into the fort. He blocked the way, waving his sword and yelling for them to halt, but the villagers wouldn't listen. They tore past him and beat him unconscious with the butt of their guns. Then they did something that I never thought I would say on this channel. They stormed the Austrian garrison and looted the armory. Soon, the whole village was armed with Austrian muskets and bayonets. The soldiers inside the fort had no choice but to lay down their arms and surrender. And that's when the fighting really started. With no weapons, the Austrians had only their fists, swords and bayonets. The villagers, however, had rifles and bayonets, and they weren't afraid to use them. Dozens of soldiers were killed as the villagers went on a rampage, destroying everything inside the fort. They pillaged the stores, smashing barrels of beer and wine and throwing them into the street. Then they turned on the livestock. The poor horses and cattle were cut down and butchered, and their meat was cooked over fires lit in the streets. Meanwhile, the soldiers huddled in a corner, trying to protect themselves from the angry villagers. Eventually, the damage was done. The villagers had taken their revenge and the fighting came to a stop, but things were about to get worse. The villagers dragged the surviving soldiers out of the fort and tied them up. Then they marched them through the streets, beating them all the way to the nearest jail. By this point, it was well into the morning, and the entire village was a mess. Homes were destroyed, corpses littered the streets, and the smell of death hung heavy in the air. After tying up the last of the soldiers, the villagers went home to clean up and try to salvage what was left of their town. As for the soldiers, they spent the next 3 days in jail until a representative from the local government arrived. The representative wasn't there to help them, though he was there to collect taxes. He forced the soldiers to pay for the damages they had caused or face charges of arson and looting. The captain, Ludwig von der Roon, was able to convince the representative to let him pay for the damage with military funds, and while he did that, he was secretly writing a letter to his commanding officer explaining exactly what had happened the night before. It wasn't long before news of the incident reached Vienna. The emperor was furious and immediately ordered an investigation. What happened at Karansebes became known throughout Europe as the battle that happened by accident, and it's been studied by military leaders ever since. But nobody has ever agreed on who is to blame. Some say that it was the fault of the captain who left the fort undefended. Others say that it was the fault of the officers who got drunk and fired off their weapons. But I think the blame falls squarely on the shoulders of the military leadership, especially Field Marshal Daun. You see, the whole reason that this battle happened at all was because of Daun's request. If he hadn't asked for reinforcements, then de Roon would have had no reason to leave the fort. And if de Roon hadn't left the fort, then the officers wouldn't have gotten drunk, and the soldiers wouldn't have attacked the village. Sure, the villagers attacked the fort because they thought that the soldiers were Turks, but who's to say that they were totally innocent? Maybe someone in the village was a Turk, or maybe the villagers simply didn't like having soldiers quartered in their town. Either way, the responsibility for this battle lies squarely with the officers of the Austrian army, and to add insult to injury, none of them ever faced any consequences. I hope you enjoyed this episode of History's Biggest Mistakes. If you did, please subscribe and leave me a comment telling me what mistake you want to see next. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all next time.